very much. There'll actually be three of us presenting because I've just brought on board the researcher on this project is Sarah Stefano. So I thought since she'll be heading up a lot of the primary research, I'll let her take that part of it. But a project that I proposed and Ryan merging together to form one. So it seems like two projects because it is. But we're hopefully by the end our shared research agenda will become clear. So we've only just begun. So this is again just scoping out a project that hasn't begun yet. So we begin in terms of kind of framing the question about why could you care about the household? Why would that matter? Again, as economists, macroeconomists, there's a kind of applied micro foundations. So again, the rational individual is still the foundation here. The household is not about individual rationality, but rather about human relationality and how relationality shapes the contours of economic transactions and kind of regularities. So we're asking kind of bigger questions that why would this matter to macroeconomists? And therefore, the kind of big framing issues we need to grab people's attention is, again, this kind of debate around secular stagnation and the decline of economic order. So when we have a kind of global economy that is teetering on the brink of recession, the forecasts are quite gloomy. And we have this kind of, on the verge of Brexit, this idea that, a national economy will deliberately engage in economic self-harm, despite all the warnings of the downfalls of Brexit. It still pursues ahead as the will of the people. They want to take back control from global markets. We're asking the question, is this kind of quagmire of secular stagnation really what is fueling economic, political, and social instability? Is the root? This is the question we're grappling with. Is the root of all of this instability actually a bigger issue in economic decline, the kind of morbid symptoms of economic decline that we could trace back, for example, to the fall of the Roman Empire and their great economic system, to the fall of Keynesianism in the 1970s? We draw very strong parallels. Are we witnessing here political instability that emanates from economic instability? We're asking questions about how does financial deregulation integrate households via residential mortgages and stratified consumer products into a kind of debt-led demand regime. So how is this dependence on debt to drive growth linking into other forms of economic and global instability? And also asking the question, is austerity prudent when it involves quantitative easing for the financial sector and the downloading of costs of adjustment onto households? So here, if we think about this 14% of jobs that you point out, in 2008 it was very clear that those 14% of jobs were JP Morgan and Goldman Sachs had to be saved. Perhaps creative destruction would have been to allow the entire global commercial banking system to be destroyed, and that was the decision that was made to protect it. But is it the case that this prolonged afterlife of the global financial crisis that we find ourselves in is really about downloading costs onto the household as prudent, but not acknowledging the huge amount of liabilities that we're incurring that has to fund that? So the question, why these questions are relevant to macroeconomists and why we need to look at the household, is rather to think about it, to draw the kind of metaphorical parallel that the household becomes a lens. So, we heard a lot about the kind of physics, the math, and kind of looking through a kind of physics lens around energy. Here, this is about looking at physics and understanding this kind of metaphor of the lens, that if we bend light in a certain way or we filter light in a certain way, we can see different things. So if we use the household, the institution of the household as a lens, would we have a different way of seeing macroeconomic trends? So in particular here, my project is interested in trying to find the interconnection between distribution within households and redistribution across households, and the ways in which macroeconomics is blind to these dynamics, this relationality. And importantly, this could be a reaction against the heterogeneity of households. They are so different, they are extremely stratified, geographically dislocated and not connected to each other, in some ways highly connected So if we imagine a household as just an address, we cannot see the ways in which global migration, so somebody sending a household member to work in another country and send remittances back, cannot be seen. These flows of incomes are invisible. But also, crucially, much of the work done in the household is invisible if it is unpaid. But nevertheless, absolutely essential for the functioning and stability of the economy. And so therefore, the King's College side of the project, and I'll pass over to Ryan after this slide, is looking at the kind of cultures of expertise that exist in macroeconomic landscapes to find out how it is that different kind of applied use of macroeconomics, whether in the central bank, in our case, or in the financial regulator, if there are kind of cultures of expertise that exist, and how do they understand and view the household in their formation of public policy and in their evaluation of the success or failure of a policy, for example. So the focus then is on, as I said, the central bank here is about an arm's length institution using macroeconomic tools for monetary policy, and the focus on the Financial Conduct Authority is about this arm's length kind of technocratic regulator of the economy. How do they understand the role of the household? So this is particularly relevant if you think, for example, that despite financial deregulation, this is the point made by Mayan and Sufi, banks were unable to create even one financial product that decreased the level of risks that households took to external shocks, right? This is their point. So again, if we look at the consumer credit market, although we live in an era of, well, almost negative real interest rates, but very close to zero interest rates, we have these huge problems that can only be seen at the level of the household. So for example, if I wanted to lend, or if I wanted to borrow 50 million pounds, I could do so for a fraction of an interest rate. If I wanted to borrow 50,000 pounds, I could do so, or a 500,000 pound mortgage, for example, I could get it for 2%. If I wanted to borrow 50,000 pounds as a small household, you could maybe get that for about 5%, but not as an SME because you wouldn't get it at all. But a £5,000 loan for a used car, that's about 8.5% interest. A £50 loan from the payday lender, 500% interest you're paying. So there's a highly stratified market for credit that gets more and more expensive the less you want to borrow, despite the scale being so small that it's not a real risk to the bank's balance sheet. So we have this kind of huge distortion. And we have that distortion exist as a small saver as well. If we imagine I got tomorrow £50,000 inheritance, point again to Piketty's intervention, and I put it in the bank. You know, I'm a small saver. I just want liquid savings. I want a nest egg. What would the bank give me for £50,000? 0.5%? 1%? Something like that. I'm a money saving expert. Not much more than that. If I instead bought two flats in the 10 miles from here on the outskirts of Edinburgh, I could be getting a yield of £800 a month in rent. You know, this is the types of the choices that households must face, and we're not unpacking it when we see it completely at the level of just the macroeconomy. And so it's asking these kind of questions. How relevant is it to have a lens of the household, to see the household as an institution within macroeconomic policymaking? What would be different? What would be added to our study? That's what we're going to be looking at over the next 9 months.
Okay, so it's my pleasure to be here, and as said, I'm a new member to the research team, and actually I will officially join King's College to work with Johnna on this project on the 1st of October, and it is a pleasure to be here to meet all of you differently involved with the Rebuilding Macroeconomics Network. So following on the main research questions that Johnna just presented, and reminding you that so this is the very initial phase of this research project, I will share with you a few more ideas on the rationale and the type of approach that we plan to use in order to develop this project in the next 9 months. So going back to the issue, that of course is the focus of the Institutions Hub, as Laura mentioned, of cultures of expertise. So why do we want to look at the cultures of expertise in this particular project? And the overarching reason is that the literature tends to suggest, and literature from different disciplines, that the cultures of expertise are an important dimension of macroeconomic institutional landscapes. And in particular, they allow us to understand different aspects of the process of policy making. And so, for example, if we consider that it can happen, and this is what some research shows, that macroeconomic institutions may change the rhetoric or the narrative around how to treat specific problems, but then there may be gaps in policy practice and implementation. So, for example, I can refer you to the work by Daniela Gabor, who's, as many of you probably know, is also part of the Rebuilding Macroeconomics Network, and she will be here tomorrow, looking at the IMF. She found that around 2010, when the IMF's understanding around the importance of financial interconnectedness at the global level was an important factor in creating and in increasing financial fragility. And a report by the IMF was published in 2010 exactly on this topic. Nonetheless, the type of advice that the IMF was providing to individual countries, particularly the Global South, was one of encouragement to participation in these global financial networks. So there are often gaps between rhetoric and practice that can be uncovered by understanding what happens in the policy-making process. Indeed, there is evidence that the cultures of expertise, so like in a way, like the ways in which knowledge is created and transmitted within macroeconomic institutions, is indeed very important in shaping this process. So going back to the context before the global financial crisis, for example, Geneva report on the world economy looked at the importance of communication approaches and strategies used by central banks. And asserted that transparency in communication was an important aspect in order to ensure the effectiveness of monetary policy. And drawing on research conducted in other disciplines, so for example, international political economy, and the work done particularly by Seabrook on the so-called linked ecologies, which essentially are networks of professionals, okay, and experts. Research conducted on financial reform experts and on experts and staff in international organizations shows that these linked ecologies are very important in shaping how a problem is framed and eventually treated in policy making, showing also how, like in some cases, the knowledge held by staff of international organizations is at the core of how shapes primarily how a problem will be treated, and the views of other experts is often used in a selective way. Or also, like, there is another strand of anthropological work looking at various institutions, such as the World Bank, for example, or departments of the government, like such as the Department for International Development, looking at everyday practices of professionalization and the mechanisms of knowledge transmission. So with this background in mind, We want to look at the cultures of expertise and the knowledge held in the Bank of England and the Financial Conduct Authority on the notion of the household, which to our knowledge is something on which we don't have any literature yet. So our aim is to begin to fulfill this gap in the literature, which might be particularly timely also in the context of growing concern with household debt. In parallel to this, so this is, if you want, second component of the project, we will develop a policy toolkit around a methodology for the conceptualization of the household. And the way in which we envisage this policy toolkit to be formed is for it to be relevant to policymakers, and so in that sense our study of the cultures of expertise will inform how to make this policy toolkit relevant, and it will be structured around specific conceptual and methodological blind spots that we will identify in the study of cultures of expertise, and informed by discussions between academics and non-academics, and crucially is going to be grounded in on foundational pillars, both conceptual and methodological, of the household that are derived from our, as a team, cross-disciplinary engagement with the study and the analysis of the household. How we're going to make this policy toolkit usable and relevant is also an important part of the story. And again, drawing on our study of macroeconomic institutional landscapes and cultures of expertise around the household, we want to identify specific points where we think that policymakers will be particularly interested in expanding or changing the ways in which they conceptualize the household. And we are planning to involve partners and other institutions in order to facilitate this type of engagement with the policy toolkit. And so finally, and then I'll hand over to Ryan, why use the household as a policy lens? And as Johnna has mentioned, our starting point is an understanding of the household as an economic institution that is central to the economics of distribution and redistribution. And indeed, many of us will be aware that for a long time economics has not very much looked at what happens within the household in terms of decision-making processes, relations, and also work. And this was partly done in a systematic way with Gary Becker's New Household Economics, which was a significant transformation in economic theory, and nonetheless, for some of the assumptions used to sort of underpinning the conceptualization of the household in the New Household Economics, such as the single utility function, the hypothesis of altruism of the household head, and income pooling among household members. So for these, from certain perspectives, restrictive assumptions, this conceptualization of the household has been considered, particularly by feminist economists and anthropologists, not sufficient to really understand what happens within the household. And on the basis of this criticism, a body of empirical literature looking at the intra-household dynamics, so the inner workings of the household, and how these dynamics fundamentally shape consumption, production, and also policy outcomes. We have seen a shift in economic theory from unitary models of the household to collective models of the household, where the latter, to put it simply, draw more on game theory and on an understanding of bargaining power within the household, and they are structured around the relations of conflict or cooperation. So I think it's fair to say that the recognition of what happens within the household is quite established, okay, and we need to consider this aspect. And we would like to complement this also with the idea that the household as an institution also has the capacity to influence macroeconomic phenomena. And so this requires also understanding the interrelations among households and to understand the household as being embedded in the global economy.
Hi, so Johnna and Sarah have told you how they'll study the cultures of expertise in macro institutions about the household. My component of our project also uses the household as a lens to analyse macroeconomic policy, but I do so in the opposite direction, situating my analysis with a bottom-up perspective on how ordinary households experience macroeconomic policy and with what accompanying forms of inequality. So why inequality is the focus here? Well, there's a growing body of evidence demonstrating a circular relationship between economic inequality and fundamental limitations in our post-crisis macroeconomic policymaking, showing that inequality is preventing our economic institutions from being more effective. I won't go through these in detail, now there are references on here, but suffice it to say, a growing body of evidence at the moment is highlighting connections between inequality and financial instability, for example, and the Brexit referendum being perhaps the starkest example of that at the moment, currently posing the greatest risk to the UK's financial stability. It's something that most social scientists have identified as an expression of economic inequality. Given this, we're left asking, where does the inequality come from? Or, in other words, what are the processes that produce and reproduce economic inequalities? Since 2008, independent financial regulators, the UK government and the Bank of England have strengthened their commitment to protecting citizens from financial harm. So the Bank of England, for example, considers that high household indebtedness can pose risks to stability, reporting on the recent expansion of consumer credit and taking steps including setting capital buffers to ensure lenders can absorb severe losses. On the consumer protection side of things, since its creation in 2013, the Financial Conduct Authority has sought to curb exploitative lending practices by capping interest in the high-cost short-term credit and rent-to-own sectors, so payday lenders and the like. Alongside this, the FCA has vastly increased the protection of what they call vulnerable customers, such as those with mental health issues, turning what had been a matter of voluntary codes of practice into regulation with hefty sanctions. However, between the mitigation of systemic vulnerabilities and the protection of vulnerable consumers, there's a third kind of financial harm that's totally overlooked in our current institutional arrangements. Namely, the ability of credit instruments to extract wealth from ordinary borrowers, leaving them net worse off. Now, this obviously doesn't happen all the time. You only need to think of those who pay off a mortgage and thereby improve their position in society. But there is a simple truth that's rarely acknowledged, namely that household borrowing often leaves the borrower worse off. The implications of this point with policy are not yet fully understood, and this leads to the central research questions of this part of our project. So how do macro policies affect debt's ability to extract wealth? How does the way that macro institutions understand inequality affect the inequality within households? In other words, for today's situation in the UK, how does the current institutional separation of financial stability and consumer protection influence levels of inequality? So let me outline the research methods that are used to investigate this. The research is designed specifically to connect multiple scales: street-level ethnography into borrowing and livelihood practices with the financial structures of the companies supplying the debt, and prudential regulation at the national level. At the street level, I'll look into the transfers of economic value that household financial debt relations involve. And I'll do this through ethnography, a method of research, as I'm sure many of you know, where you spend extended periods of time with the people that you're studying, observing their everyday habits while participating alongside them. Studying livelihood in the round, I'll look at the mixture of paid and unpaid exchanges and creative efforts that constitute a household. And I'll draw on cutting-edge insights from feminist sociology and economic anthropology. So rather than study inequality by looking at aggregate measures such as the Gini coefficient, I'll turn the study and draw on work that's turned the study of inequality on its head by studying ordinary people's efforts to get their labours and struggles recognised as having value at all. Connecting this to the mid-level, I'll look at what household financial debt relations operate in households in the city of Plymouth, where I've done fieldwork since 2012. And that will involve volunteer placements at debt advice services in the city. I'll collect data through the debt advice case management systems and interviews with indebted households, comparing this to local data since 2012. And connecting the street and mid-levels to the top level, I'll look at how policies around systemic risk and consumer protection have reshaped household financial debts. And we'll wrap up there and look forward to hearing your questions. Thank you.